From the silent ruins of a village scarred by exile, a voice began to rise. It wasn't a cry nor a roar, but the steady whisper of a child who would one day challenge the indifference of an entire nation. That child was Malachi, the final prophet of the Old Testament. In a time when Judah was just beginning to heal from Babylon's wounds, a living hope was born, wrapped in flesh and bone. His name wasn't chosen at random, my messenger. A prophecy hidden within an identity. The people had returned from exile with broken hearts, burdened by the weight of their past and aching for the promise of a future. The stones of the newly rebuilt temple still carried the earthy scent of a nation striving to look heavenward once again. No one recalls the exact day of his birth, but the elders used to say it happened under a clear sky, when the stars seemed to watch in silence as the Holy Land was reborn. His parents were ordinary folk, laborers with hands worn by soil and souls anchored in the promises of the Most High. From an early age, Malachi was different. Not for his strength or his voice, but for the depth in his eyes. While other children ran wild across the hills, he wandered alone, listening, watching, absorbing every story the elders told of Moses, Elijah, and the miracles that once shook mountains. One evening, as the sun faded over the fields of Judah, his father was sharpening a tool and spoke to him plainly, "You are our messenger, Malachi. God has a plan for you." The boy said nothing in return, but something in his gaze flickered with light. He didn't yet understand the path ahead, but he could already feel its weight. In Israel, names were never just sounds. They were callings. They were roads. They were destinies written by the hand of heaven. And his was already beginning to echo like a voice meant to awaken sleeping souls. His father's words didn't vanish like a passing breeze. They echoed within him, like a seed stirring beneath the surface. Malachi could hear them even in silence, in the hushed conversations of the elders, in the whispers of the wind over the fields, and in the restless sighs that stole his sleep at night. From a young age, he knew the eyes of the people watched him with quiet expectation. No one spoke of it aloud, but everyone felt it. There was something different about him, not in the way he spoke or looked, but in those still moments when he sat entranced, watching the scribes recite the scriptures or observing from a distance the sacrifices being offered in the temple. Within him burned a nameless flame, a silent certainty that he was destined to carry a message, even before he understood what that message was. And as he grew, the world around him seemed to crumble spiritually. Faith, once solid as stone, had become as brittle as dry clay. The name he bore, Malachi, felt more and more like a promise on the verge of erupting. But what does one do with such a heavy burden when the destination remains unknown? Outwardly, Judah looked restored. The temple gleamed in the sunlight like a polished jewel. But the souls were shattered. The young prophet walked through the markets, where merchants manipulated their scales with cunning and selfishness. He heard the poisoned whispers of neighbors speaking of debts and betrayal. Injustice spread like weeds among wheat, fast, silent, and consuming. In the temple, the heart of the nation, Malachi found only disappointment. Distracted priests, sacrifices offered without passion, rituals performed without meaning. The covenant with God, that sacred bond that had held Israel together for generations, was unraveling before his eyes. Some dared to ask aloud, "Does God even care about us anymore?" Others whispered the question as if afraid of what the answer might be. And Malachi burned. Not with rage, but with a conviction that grew fiercer with every injustice, every lie, every hollow gesture of faith. He remembered Isaiah, Jeremiah, Elijah, men who never asked to be prophets, but who were called when their people needed them most. Would he be the next? It wasn't ambition. It was a weight already beginning to carve the shape of his destiny. Mornings in Judah passed with their usual rhythm. The noise of traders, the shouts of vendors, the ceaseless shuffle of feet on the stone streets. But to Malachi, these sounds began to fade as if coming from another world. His soul moved to a different frequency, drawn not by noise but by something deeper, an urgency of the spirit. Often, he escaped to the hills that cradled his village, where the air was pure and the wind's murmur replaced the clamor of men. There, under the vast sky, he searched for something he didn't yet know how to name. He knelt in the dirt, closed his eyes, and spoke to the God who seemed silent. Until one day that silence broke. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't a voice from the clouds. It was something more intimate, more profound. It was as if the words had been planted inside him from birth, and in that moment they all bloomed at once. He couldn't explain it. He simply felt it. A moment of light, a sudden clarity that pierced his mind and ignited his chest. "You will be the messenger of Malachi. Go and speak. There were no lightning bolts, no visible miracles. Only his breath, fast and uneven. His heart, pounding like a sacred drum. And a certainty he could no longer deny: God had spoken to him. The burden that once tormented him transformed into a living flame, a mission that lit up every corner of his soul. The time for silence was over. He descended from the hill with his eyes wide open. Everything looked different. People stared at him without knowing why, but he did. He carried something within. Something unseen, but soon to be heard. But where to begin? The temple looked alive from the outside, but inside, it was dead. Malachi knew he had to confront a faith that had become a hollow ritual. He needed courage. And he needed wisdom, to translate the voice of God into words that would shake the people awake. As he stepped into the temple, the echo of his footsteps reverberated through his soul. Every corner felt asleep. From the outer court, he watched the priests go about their duties, but there was no devotion in their movements. Only routine. Only weariness. The robes meant to radiate holiness were stained with neglect and apathy. Then it happened. They brought in a lame lamb for sacrifice. And no one flinched. His chest tightened. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a sign, a painful confirmation of how far they had drifted from the covenant. Malachi stood frozen as if time had paused around him. And he understood. He could no longer remain silent. The voice burning within him had to shatter his people's indifference, even if it cost him everything. When he finally gathered his courage, Malachi crossed the temple threshold with steady steps. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from the urgency to obey the voice he knew had come from above. He approached one of the priests trying to catch his attention. But the man, without even lifting his eyes, waved him off impatiently. "Come back later, boy. We're busy." The rejection was sharp, curt, humiliating, but not unexpected. Malachi stepped back wounded, but not defeated. He knew this wasn't about him. It wasn't about pride or recognition. God had sent him. And even if the ears within the temple were shut tight, truth still cried out to be spoken. As he walked out, fragments of whispered conversations reached him. Temple servants murmuring about botched sacrifices, worthless offerings, and sacred items secretly sold or repurposed for personal gain. Rage sparked in his chest, but he knew this corruption wasn't limited to the religious elite. Evil had seeped into every corner of the land like an invisible poison. As he wandered through the stone streets of Jerusalem, his body moved, but his mind raced elsewhere. He thought about the covenant, the promises, the fiery devotion that once lived in the hearts of the people. Where had it all gone? How had their love for the God who rescued them grown so cold? A commotion on the corner snapped him out of his thoughts. A merchant, red-faced and furious, accused a customer of paying with counterfeit weights. The man shouted back, claiming the vendor's scale was rigged. Their voices clashed like swords, both angry, neither innocent. Malachi watched in silence. This wasn't just a dispute over silver. It was a mirror, reflecting a society that had traded justice for greed, truth for gain. As he continued on, he noticed a woman sitting by the roadside, head bowed, shoulders trembling. She clutched a small cloth pouch in her lap. A few coins, likely not enough. Malachi didn't need to ask. He understood. She was a casualty of a system no longer built to protect the weak, but to consume them. And when he reached the city square, what he saw cut even deeper. A group of young men mocked the traditions of their fathers. They laughed as they mimicked temple rituals, flailing their arms in exaggerated gestures, their voices dripping with sarcasm. One of them, between fits of cruel laughter, said something that struck Malachi like a blade to the chest. None of this matters anymore. Malachi felt the earth quake beneath his feet. This wasn't mere irreverence, it was the legacy of spiritual neglect. The laughter of these youths was the echo of a nation that had forgotten its God. Then another voice chimed in, low, bitter, filled with despair. If God really cared, he would have blessed us by now. The words reverberated through Malachi's soul like a poisoned wind. It wasn't just blasphemy. It was the mournful cry of a disillusioned generation. A knot formed in his throat. That sentence captured the entire chasm that now separated the people from their Creator. They hadn't just lost their way. They had stopped looking for it. And Malachi knew, more than ever, that the message he carried could no longer wait. The nights grew endless once Malachi understood that silence was no longer an option. He withdrew to his small refuge, a humble space where only a flickering oil lamp pushed back the suffocating dark. Shadows danced along the walls, whispering stories of broken covenants, hardened hearts, and a faith dissolving like mist. He knew God was calling him to be a spark in the middle of that darkness. But how? What if no one listened? Doubt clung to him like a second skin. In the midst of one of those nights, as his prayers shifted from whispers to cries, the vision came. Suspended in the heavens, an enormous scale appeared before him. On one side, lies, injustice, apathy weighed heavy like mountains. On the other, truth and obedience barely moved the balance. Then suddenly, a fire surged from the depths like a consuming judgment. But it wasn't wild wrath, it was cleansing. A holy purification. When his eyes opened, Malachi was no longer the same. His heart beat with unshakable purpose. It wasn't enough to name the sin. It was time to proclaim judgment and hope. In the days that followed, Malachi walked through the city with a steadiness that came from above. But no matter where he turned, corruption clung to every corner. A man stumbled past, his robe torn and worn thin by debt, his burden etched into every step. Children, gaunt and hollow-eyed, stared in silence while well-fed merchants strolled by with baskets overflowing, never stopping, never seeing. And in the temple, especially in the temple, the very air was heavy with emptiness. The scent of sacrifices lingered, but they carried no soul, no surrender, only the staleness of routine. Malachi's heart ached. This was supposed to be the place where justice began. But now, it was just another monument to forgotten reverence. He knew this would be an uphill war. The people had learned to live as if God were a myth, as if his promises were dusty tales stripped of power. But deep in his bones, Malachi felt something stirring. God would show himself again, with a force that could not be ignored. The only question left was, would they be ready? He stopped before the entrance of the temple. The sky was just beginning to blush with the colors of dawn, but he barely noticed. The weight in his chest was too heavy, too urgent. Today would be the turning point. He had to speak. He had to remind the priests of the covenant, the one that began with Levi, the one sealed in awe and reverence, not in weariness and disdain. With resolute steps he crossed the threshold. The temple wasn't quiet out of reverence. It was the hush of abandonment. A few priests moved about half-heartedly, their motions dull, their eyes hollow. Holy service had become just another task on a list. And that was when Malachi drew a deep breath. The moment had come. A hushed murmur stirred through the temple. Something was about to break. Low voices, small concerns, idle chatter about tasks, debts, and trivial matters. And yet, in the midst of this, Malachi stood still, watching, feeling something ignite within him. It burned with every second of indifference, growing hotter with each careless word spoken near the sacred. He began to walk, slow, purposeful steps, until he stood at the altar. He asked no permission. He waited for no invitation. A few heads lifted, puzzled. Others glanced at him with thinly veiled irritation. But when he spoke, his voice cut through the air like a blade. "Do you remember the covenant with Levi?" His words echoed across the holy chamber, clear, mournful, yet unwavering. A few priests paused, unsure whether to ignore him or pay attention. Others chose to stay busy, pretending not to hear, clinging to their routines like a shield. But Malachi did not hesitate. Levi walked with God in integrity. He honored his name, not just with words but with the way he lived. And you have defiled this altar. You've brought worthless offerings. Words that carry no weight. A heavy silence fell. Then came the murmurs, a wave of discomfort, denial, rising like a tide. But Malachi stood firm. He spoke of how corruption had seeped into even the most sacred rituals. Of how acts of worship had become lifeless routines, hollow performances without soul. He reminded them of the forgotten purpose of that ancient covenant, to bring life, peace, restoration. It wasn't too late. Not yet. But to return, they would have to wake up. To see again. To feel again. The stares he received were a mix of disbelief, shame, and resistance. But something shifted in him. He understood then. His message couldn't remain trapped inside walls of stone or hearts of cold ritual. It had to reach the people. The soul of the nation. He stepped out of the temple and into the pulsing veins of the city. The market buzzed with chaos. Voices tangled in negotiations. Laughter clashed with shouting. The smell of spices mingled with roasted meat and warm bread. It was life in motion. And yet, amid all that vibrancy, Malachi felt a crushing emptiness. The people moved as if nothing were wrong. As if their distance from God had become as natural as the air they breathed. That's when he knew he had to speak again. Climbing onto a stone platform, he drew in a deep breath. "Listen," he called, his voice rising above the din. Heads turned, some curious, others annoyed. "The Lord is sending a messenger," he declared, his voice ringing with urgency. Someone who will prepare the way. He will come like a refining fire, like soap that scrubs the deepest stain. He looked over the crowd. Eyes met his, uncertain, wary, questioning. But the silence that followed was different from the temple's cold hush. This one carried breath. Possibility. The first tremor of awakening. The noise of the market faded, as if time itself had drawn a breath and held it still. Malachi's voice lingered in the air, not as a shout, but as a flame, quiet, steady, undeniable. He spoke of a fire that did not consume but refined. A fire that purified gold and hearts. Who can endure the day of his coming? He asked, and the question fell like a stone into a silent lake, sending invisible ripples through the crowd. The hush that followed was thicker than any outcry, haunted, searching. And among the people, uncertainty began to stir. Doubts, whispers, unease. What if that messenger was already walking among them? Malachi understood that his message wasn't meant to provide easy answers. It was meant to awaken deep, restless questions. His words weren't just to be heard, they were meant to be felt. Like seeds, they would take root in sleepless nights and echo through the restless corners of the soul. The crowd began to drift away, some in contemplative silence, others whispering in confusion, but Malachi knew it wasn't finished. Something still pressed against his chest, urgent, unresolved. The vision wasn't complete. Not yet. Nights in Judah had turned colder, but Malachi wandered the empty streets without noticing the chill against his skin. His mind churned like the wind that snaked between stone homes. He had seen something more, something that refused to remain quiet. In his visions, a light had blazed before him. Not a simple flame, but a radiant brilliance that shattered darkness at its root. It was not just a celestial sign, it was a promise. The Son of Righteousness. And that promise could not wait. With the first light of dawn, he climbed a nearby hill. Against the rising sky, his silhouette stood like a beacon. People began to gather again, drawn not by his presence, but by something deeper, an unseen force woven into every word he carried, a divine weight in his voice that no man could produce. Raising his hands, he called for silence. The wind itself paused to listen. The day is coming, he declared, his voice rolling like soft thunder. A day unlike any before. A day when the righteous would feel the healing warmth of the Son of Righteousness, and the wicked would be like straw, consumed in a blaze they could not escape. A restless murmur spread through the crowd. Some looked skyward as if expecting to see that sun rise immediately. Others frowned, struggling to grasp the meaning of those burning words. But Malachi went on, painting with his voice a future filled with redemption for those who revere the Lord. A future where they would run free like calves released from their stalls, wild with joy, unshackled, unafraid. A few smiled at the image, touched by its hope. Others shivered as if the wind had returned, whispering of a coming reckoning. Deep down they knew they were not ready for that day. Remember, Malachi cried out, his voice tearing through the valley like a trumpet blast. The Lord is faithful to his promises. But who among you is truly prepared? His words stretched across the horizon, carried by the wind as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting a golden-orange glow that seemed to echo the tension he carried within, a fragile border between what had been and what was coming, between the ending of one age and the beginning of another. He felt the weight of time pressing against his shoulders. His season was ending. But his voice still had one final purpose. He gathered the people again, and this time, he spoke not as a messenger, but as a man pouring out everything he had left. Remember the law of Moses? He thundered, each syllable cutting through the thickening air. Remember the commands given at Horeb to all of Israel. His voice rang like a bell in the silence, hanging in the air like a sacred charge. These were not just words of warning. They were cries from the depths of his soul, born out of a love that refused to surrender, a love for a people who had drifted far from the heart of their God. Malachi knew what the nation truly needed wasn't just prophecy. It was a foundation, a spiritual anchor, something that would hold them steady as time rolled forward, silent, relentless. But there was still more. One final revelation burned in his chest. I will send the prophet Elijah, he declared, and the very sky seemed to tremble at the force of it. Before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord, the crowd stirred instantly. Elijah? They whispered in disbelief. The man who challenged kings, who called down fire from the heavens, how could he return? Malachi scanned the faces before him. Some lit with hope, others darkened with doubt. This prophet will come with a mission, he continued, unwavering, to turn the hearts of fathers to their children, and the hearts of children to their fathers. Then he paused. Let the weight of silence do its work. Because if he does not, the land will be struck with a curse. The silence that followed was not merely stillness, it was a presence. A breathless moment suspended in eternity. As if the very fate of a people hung on the edge of those final words. Malachi knew. He knew this was his last message. The messenger was stepping off the stage. But the story was far from over. Fulfillment would come in its time. And in the days that followed, an uncanny stillness settled over Judah. Not the quiet of indifference but something deeper, almost sacred. As if his voice still drifted on the wind, echoing down alleyways, slipping through cracks in the stone, whispering in hearts that could not forget. Small gatherings formed in corners of the city, voices hushed, eyes wide, pondering the mystery. What did it mean that Elijah would return? Others avoided the subject altogether, as if simply speaking of judgment might summon it. Malachi no longer sought the crowds. He wandered the streets alone, watching in silence. He saw families gathering around their tables, merchants calling out at their stalls, priests moving through the temple with rehearsed solemnity. Life continued as if nothing had changed, yet everything had. He had fulfilled what the Lord had asked of him. The message had been spoken. The choice now belonged to the people. But deep within his heart he sensed it, most were not ready. And with time the man named Malachi faded from sight and became something else. A legend. Some whispered he had vanished into the mountains, like the prophets of old. Others claimed he still walked among them, unseen, waiting for his words to be fulfilled. No one knew for sure. The only certainty was the silence he left behind. And it was no ordinary silence. It was vast, echoing, sacred. For more than 400 years heaven spoke no new word. For centuries of waiting, of longing, of questioning. A chasm between two eras, between what had been and what was still to come. And yet, despite that silence, Malachi had never doubted. He knew God's plan was unstoppable. He had declared it with his final breath. A messenger would come, one who would prepare the way. And that messenger, though unseen, was closer than anyone dared to believe. The silence that followed was not absence. It was preparation. It was a womb of destiny, holding the heartbeat of a coming promise. And in those long years, Judah lived in the shadow of Malachi's warnings and his hopes. The Son of Righteousness, the messenger, the refining fire. These visions burned on. Even when God felt distant, his echo lingered. Yet Malachi did not leave behind only prophecy. He left a legacy. His life was a quiet flame in the dark, a testimony to the power of faithfulness in an age of compromise. He was no king, no warrior. He didn't stir nations with grand oration, but his strength was forged in conviction, in a faith that could not be bent. He stood against corruption. He defied apathy. He refused to surrender to the weariness of his people. And he showed us, God's voice can dwell in any willing soul, even when the world has lost its way. He called us to turn inward, to examine what we bring before the Lord. Are our sacrifices pure? Is our worship true? His questions still echo, not just in history but in us. Are we light in the midst of such darkness? Above all, Malachi spoke to us of hope, a hope not anchored in what we see but in an eternal promise. He was not the fulfillment. He was the herald, the one who announced what was yet to come. And when, centuries later, heaven finally spoke again, it did so with the cry of a man in the wilderness, just as Malachi had declared. God's story never stops. And if there's one thing we've learned from this quiet yet steadfast prophet, it's that even in the longest night, he is still writing the next chapter. If this story moved you, inspired you in any way, please like the video, share it with those you love, and subscribe to the channel. Here we will keep exploring the most powerful stories of the Bible.